The darkness that had enveloped Grace Evans wasn't sudden. It crept in like twilight, stealing pieces of her world until nothing remained but sounds, smells, and the memories of colors she'd once known. Now, at 22, she sat alone in the small cabin that had been her childhood home, listening to the retreating hoofbeats of her last remaining family as they abandoned her to the unforgiving Montana territory of 1878. Grace clutched the wooden edge of her rocking chair, feeling splinters threaten her fingertips as the sound of her cousin's wagon grew fainter. "We just can't manage anymore," he had explained with practiced sorrow. "The gold's dried up in Helena and California's calling. You understand, don't you?" She understood perfectly. A blind woman was a burden, especially one who had lost her sight to fever just 3 years prior. Her parents were long dead, claimed by the same epidemic that took her vision, and now her extended family had finally found their excuse to leave her behind. The cabin had enough supplies for a month: flour, beans, jerky, and a well nearby. They had done the minimum to appease their conscience. Grace knew her chances of survival were slim, but stubbornness ran in her blood. If she was to die, she would do so fighting. The first week passed in careful routine. Grace had memorized every inch of her home long ago, counting steps between the hearth and table, between the bed and door. She prepared simple meals, drawing water from the well using the rope system her father had built years ago. But as the days wore on, she became increasingly aware of her vulnerability. Wolves howled at night, closer than before. Twice she heard unfamiliar footsteps around the cabin after dark. On the 9th day, as she was gathering kindling near the edge of the cleared area around her home, Grace heard the approach of horses 3, maybe 4 by the sound of their hooves. She froze, clutching her bundle of sticks to her chest. "Well, looky what we got here," a gravelly voice called out. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" Grace straightened her spine, turning toward the voice. "This is private property. Please move along." Rough laughter answered her. "Private property? She says it's private property, boys. And she's blind as a bat," another voice added. "Look at them cloudy eyes. Don't that just make our job easier?" The sound of dismounting men sent fear coursing through Grace's veins. She had heard stories of claim jumpers, outlaws, and worse roaming these parts. "I have nothing of value," she said, taking a step backward. "That ain't entirely true," the first voice said, now alarmingly close. "Cabin like this could fetch a decent price. And you? Well, female company's rare in these parts." Grace threw her kindling at the voice and turned to run, but strong hands grabbed her arms, causing her to scream. She fought wildly, kicking and twisting against her captor's grip. The sharp report of a rifle shot cut through her screams. "That's far enough, gentlemen," a new voice called out, deep and steady. "The lady doesn't seem to appreciate your company." The hands holding Grace loosened. "Mind your business, stranger. This doesn't concern you." 3 men threatening a blind woman. "I'm making it my concern." The newcomer's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. "Now let her go and mount up unless you're keen on meeting your maker today." Grace felt herself being shoved forward. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the rough ground. "You'll regret this," one of the men spat, but the sounds of them mounting up and riding away followed shortly after. Grace remained kneeling, heart thundering in her chest, until gentle footsteps approached and stopped before her. "Madam, are you hurt?" the voice asked, softer now. "No," she managed, though her knees stung from the fall. "Who are you?" "Yates Sullivan," he answered, and she heard him crouch down to her level. "I was passing through on my way to Chico when I heard the commotion." "Chico's 10 miles south," Grace said automatically. "That it is." There was a smile in his voice. "May I help you up, miss?" "Evans, Grace Evans." She extended her hand hesitantly and felt warm, calloused fingers close around hers, pulling her carefully to her feet. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Sullivan. Just doing what any decent man would." His voice came from above her. He was tall. "Those men. They might come back once I'm gone." Grace swallowed hard. "I'm aware." A silence stretched between them. Grace could sense him studying her. "Miss Evans, forgive my boldness, but it appears you're alone here. Is there someone coming for you? Family nearby?" Grace lifted her chin. "My situation is not your concern, Mr. Sullivan." "Fair enough," he replied, but she could hear the frown in his voice. "At least allow me to escort you back to your cabin." She nodded once and felt his light touch at her elbow. She didn't need the guidance, she knew every inch of the path, but something about his gentle assistance made her accept it without protest. At the cabin door, Grace turned to face where she presumed him to be. "Thank you again. I wish you safe travels to Chico." "About that," Yates said slowly, "I'd feel a mighty burden on my conscience leaving you here alone. Those men had the look of trouble and they know you're vulnerable." "I've managed thus far," Grace replied stiffly. "And admirably so," he agreed. "But even the strongest folks need help sometimes. I'd like to offer mine." Grace frowned. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Sullivan?" "I've got business in Chico that can wait a few days. Allow me to make some repairs to your cabin. I noticed your roof has seen better days, and perhaps set up some alarms around the perimeter. Just until I'm certain those men won't return." Grace considered his offer. Common sense told her to refuse. He was a stranger after all. But something in his voice, a sincerity she couldn't quite explain, gave her pause. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. There was a long pause before he answered. "Because 8 years ago my sister was left alone when she needed help the most. No one stopped for her." His voice had grown rough. "I can't change that, but I can be the person who stops for you." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. 3 days, she said finally. "You may stay 3 days to make repairs. You'll sleep in the lean-to behind the house." "That's more than fair," Yates replied, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "I've got some supplies on my horse. I'll get started on that roof before sunset." True to his word, Grace soon heard him climbing onto the roof, the sound of old shingles being removed and replaced filling the afternoon air. She busied herself inside, preparing a simple stew with the last of her carrots and some dried beef. When the savory smell filled the cabin, she called out from the doorway, "Mr. Sullivan, supper's ready if you'd care to join me." The hammering stopped, and she heard him descending the ladder he'd propped against the cabin. "That's mighty kind, Miss Evans. Let me wash up first." Over dinner, eaten at her small table, Grace learned that Yates Sullivan was 30 years old, born in Missouri but raised all over the Western Territories, as his father sought their fortune in various mining towns. He'd fought briefly in the latter days of the Civil War, though he spoke little of it, and had since made his living as a cattle driver, carpenter, and occasional bounty hunter. "And what brings you to Chico?" Grace asked, passing him a tin cup of coffee. "I'm meeting my former trail boss," Yates explained. "He's starting a freight company running supplies between the Northern Pacific Railroad and the smaller settlements. Offered me a position." "Sounds promising," Grace commented. "It could be," Yates agreed. "Steady work's hard to come by these days." He paused, and she heard him set down his cup. "May I ask about your situation, Miss Evans? How long have you been alone here?" Grace stiffened. "My cousins left 9 days ago. They've gone to California. And they left you." The incredulity in his voice made her wince. "I chose to stay," she lied. "Miss Evans, I don't need your pity, Mr. Sullivan." "It's not pity I'm offering," he said quietly. "It's respect. Not many would have the courage to stay on alone, especially blind." She finished for him. especially in Montana territory, he corrected. Winters here are brutal for anyone. Grace's fingers tightened around her cup. I was born in this cabin. I've survived 22 winters here. But not alone, he said gently. She had no answer for that. The next morning, Grace awoke to the sound of chopping wood. She dressed quickly and made her way outside, following the rhythmic thunk of the axe. "Good morning," she called. The chopping paused. "Morning, Miss Evans. Hope I didn't wake you." "The sun did that," she replied, gesturing toward the warmth on her face. "You're up early." "Habit from the trail," Yates explained, resuming his work. "Thought I'd build up your woodpile before winter sets in." Grace stood listening to his labor, feeling oddly comforted by his presence. After a while, she said, "I'll prepare breakfast," and turned back toward the cabin. "Much obliged," he called after her. By midday, Yates had chopped enough wood to last months, repaired the leaky roof, and was working on reinforcing the cabin's door frame. Grace had spent the morning baking bread, the familiar task giving her hands purpose while her mind churned with uncertainty. "Mr. Sullivan," she said as they sat eating lunch on the small porch he'd swept clean. "Why Chico? Pardon. Of all places to settle, why choose Chico?" Yates was quiet for a moment. "Honest answer. It's growing fast but still small enough to know your neighbors. The Yellowstone River keeps the land fertile and the railroads bringing in new folks every month. Seems like a good place to put down roots if a man was looking to do such a thing." "And are you looking to put down roots?" he chuckled softly. "Been drifting a long while, Miss Evans. The idea has its appeal." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Yates asked, "How long have you been blind, if you don't mind my asking?" Grace stiffened initially, then relaxed. 3 years. Fever took my parents and my sight in the same month." "I'm sorry," he said simply. "It was difficult," she admitted. "I had already learned how to cook and keep house, so those skills remained. But learning to navigate without sight, to identify things by touch and sound alone, that took time." "You've done remarkably well," Yates observed. Grace smiled faintly. "Necessity is a thorough teacher, Mr. Sullivan. Indeed it is." He paused, and she heard him shift in his chair. "Miss Evans, may I speak plainly? You've been quite direct thus far." "Your situation here concerns me deeply," he said, his voice low and serious. "Winter's coming, and those men know you're here alone. Even with the repairs and extra firewood, I fear for your safety." Grace's spine straightened. "What would you have me do? The nearest town is Chico, as you well know, and I've no means to get there nor connections once I arrive." "You could." He hesitated. "You could come with me when I leave for Chico." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Sullivan, if you're suggesting—" No, he interrupted hastily. "Nothing improper. I know a widow there, Mrs. Fletcher, who takes in boarders. She's a good Christian woman. You could stay with her while you determine your next steps." Grace turned her face toward the fire, feeling its warmth against her skin. "And how would I pay for this lodging? I have little money." "I understand Mrs. Fletcher sometimes needs help with household tasks," Yates said carefully. "Perhaps an arrangement could be made." Grace was quiet for a long time, considering. Finally, she asked, "Why would you do this for me, Mr. Sullivan? You've already done more than most would." There was a lengthy pause before he answered. "Because everyone deserves a chance, Miss Evans. And because I believe you have much to offer this world, if the world would only give you the opportunity." His words struck her deeply, touching a loneliness she tried to ignore. "I'll consider it," she said finally. The third day of Yates's stay dawned clear and cool. Grace woke to the now familiar sounds of him moving about outside, caring for his horse and making final repairs to the cabin. She dressed with particular care, smoothing her hair and choosing her least worn dress. She had made her decision. When Yates came in for breakfast, she was waiting by the table. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been thinking about your offer," she began without preamble. "Yes." There was a careful neutrality in his voice. "If the invitation still stands, I would like to accompany you to Chico when you leave tomorrow." She heard his quick intake of breath. "It stands," he confirmed. "You're making a wise choice, Miss Evans." "Perhaps," she allowed, "but there must be conditions, of course. I will pay my own way once we arrive. If this Mrs. Fletcher needs help, I am willing to work." And she hesitated. "I would appreciate if you would. Guide me around town initially, until I learn my way." "It would be my honor," Yates said quietly. "I'll be your eyes for as long as you need them." Something in his tone made Grace's heart flutter unexpectedly. She cleared her throat. "Then it's settled. We leave tomorrow." They spent the day preparing. Grace packed her few belongings while Yates built a simple travois to attach to his horse for her trunk. He described the device to her, explaining how it would work and assuring her that his sturdy gelding could manage the extra weight. "What about the cabin?" Grace asked as they ate their final dinner together in her home. "We'll lock it up tight," Yates answered. "It'll stand for years yet with the repairs, if you ever wish to return." Grace shook her head slowly. "No, there's nothing for me here now." The morning of their departure, Grace stood on the porch one last time, her gloved hands gripping the wooden railing. She breathed deeply, taking in the familiar sense of pine and earth that had been her world for so long. "Ready?" Yates asked gently, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," she answered, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. The journey to Chico would take most of the day. Yates helped Grace onto his horse, explaining that he would lead them on foot. "But surely that's not necessary," she protested. "I can walk alongside. The trail's rough in places," he explained. "And Samson here is used to carrying weight. He won't mind." Grace reluctantly agreed, settling into the saddle while Yates adjusted the travois behind them. As they set off, Grace felt a curious mixture of fear and excitement. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, placing her trust in a man she'd met just days ago. Yet something about Yates Sullivan's steady presence calmed her fears. He walked beside the horse, occasionally touching her arm to alert her to a low-hanging branch or describing the landscape they passed through. "There's a creek up ahead," he told her, "clear water running over smooth stones. The banks are lined with cottonwoods just starting to turn golden." "I remember autumn colors," Grace said softly, "the bright yellows and deep reds. The cottonwoods here turn the color of spun gold," Yates continued. "And beyond them, the hills are covered with grass that waves like a tawny sea when the wind blows." His descriptions painted pictures in her mind so vivid she could almost see them. As the day progressed, Grace found herself relaxing, listening to Yates's deep voice as he pointed out landmarks or shared stories of his travels. They stopped at midday to rest and eat the bread and cheese Grace had packed. Sitting on a fallen log, Grace felt the sun warm on her face. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "would you describe yourself to me?" There was a pause. "Myself?" "Yes, I'd like to know what you look like." "Well," he began awkwardly, "I stand about 6'2". Brown hair, though folks tell me it's starting to show some gray at the temples, despite me being only 30. "And your eyes?" Grace prompted. "Blue. Light blue, my mother used to say, like a summer sky." Grace nodded, building his image in her mind. "Thank you. May I ask something in return?" Yates said, "Of course. What do you miss most?" About seeing, Grace considered the question carefully. "Stars," she finally answered. "I miss looking up at night and seeing the stars, and faces the way they change when people smile or laugh." She paused. "I miss colors too, though I remember them. But mostly, I miss the independence of being able to go wherever I please without fear." Yates was quiet for a long moment. "That's a hard thing to lose," he said finally. "Yes," Grace agreed, "but I've gained other things. I hear music in voices that I never noticed before. I can tell when it might rain by the way the air feels against my skin. The world is different now, but not empty." They continued their journey, reaching the outskirts of Chico as the afternoon began to fade. Grace could smell wood smoke and hear the distant sounds of the town wagon wheels, voices, the occasional bark of a dog. "We're approaching from the east," Yates explained. "Chico's not large, but it's growing. Main Street runs north to south with businesses on both sides. The livery stables at the north end, near the river, and most of the houses spread west and south." As they entered town, Grace heard the change in the horses' hoofbeats as they moved from dirt to the packed earth of the main street. She could sense people turning to look at them, heard whispers and greetings called out to Yates. "Sullivan, back already?" "Just in time, Sullivan. Gibson's been asking after you." Yates responded to each greeting but kept moving, guiding the horse toward what he explained was the southern end of town. "Mrs. Fletcher's house is just ahead," he told Grace. "White clapboard with blue shutters and a garden out front." When they stopped, Yates helped Grace dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Her legs felt unsteady after the long ride. "Easy now," he murmured, keeping a hand at her elbow. "Take a moment to find your balance." The door of the house opened and footsteps approached. "Yates Sullivan, as I live and breathe," a woman's voice exclaimed. "You're 3 days late, young man." "Had some matters to attend to, Mrs. Fletcher," Yates replied warmly. "May I present Miss Grace Evans? She's in need of lodging, and I thought of you immediately." There was a brief pause, and Grace felt herself being studied. "Miss Evans," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice softening, "welcome to Chico. Any friend of Yates is welcome in my home." "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher," Grace replied, turning toward the voice. "Mr. Sullivan speaks highly of you." "Does he now?" The older woman sounded pleased. "Well, come inside, both of you. Supper's nearly ready, and you look done in from the journey." Mrs. Fletcher's house smelled of freshly baked bread and lavender. She guided Grace to a chair in what she described as the front parlor while Yates went to stable his horse and bring in Grace's trunk. "So, my dear," Mrs. Fletcher said once they were alone, "Yates tells me you've had some difficulty." Grace straightened her shoulders. "My family has gone to California, and I chose not to join them. Mr. Sullivan kindly offered to escort me to Chico, where I hope to establish myself." "I see." There was no pity in Mrs. Fletcher's tone, which Grace appreciated. "Well, I do have a room available. It's small but comfortable, and if you're willing to help with some household tasks, we can arrange a fair exchange for board." "I'm a competent cook," Grace offered, "and I can clean, mend, and do most household work." "Splendid," Mrs. Fletcher declared. "We'll get along famously, I'm sure." When Yates returned, they sat down to a hearty supper of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. Mrs. Fletcher kept the conversation flowing easily, telling Grace about the town and its inhabitants. "Chico's growing, but we're still a close community," she explained. "Everyone looks out for each other here." After the meal, Yates announced he needed to meet with his prospective employer but would return the following day to help Grace get acquainted with the town. "If that's amenable to you, Miss Evans," he added. "It is," Grace replied. "Thank you." When he had gone, Mrs. Fletcher showed Grace to her room, describing the layout and furnishings in detail and guiding Grace's hands to the washstand, bed, and chair. "The floorboards creak a bit by the window," she added, "but you'll get used to them. Is there anything else you need tonight?" "No, thank you," Grace said, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. "You've been very kind." Mrs. Fletcher patted her hand. "Get some rest, dear. Tomorrow's the first day of your new life in Chico." Left alone, Grace carefully unpacked her few belongings, arranging them exactly as she wanted so she could find them easily. She washed her face and hands in the basin, changed into her nightgown, and climbed into the unfamiliar bed. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds of a house not her own, Grace was surprised to find herself thinking of Yates Sullivan, his gentle manner, his careful descriptions, the way he'd come to her aid without hesitation. For the first time in years, she fell asleep with hope warming her heart. The next morning, Grace awoke to sunlight warming her face through the window and the smell of coffee wafting up from below. She dressed carefully, wanting to make a good impression on her first full day in Chico. Mrs. Fletcher was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. "Good morning, dear. You found your way down without trouble, I see." "I counted the steps last night," Grace explained, moving carefully to the chair Mrs. Fletcher guided her toward. "Clever girl," the older woman approved. "Now, eat up. Yates will be here soon and you've a busy day ahead, I expect." Sure enough, as they were finishing breakfast, a knock sounded at the door. Grace's heart quickened at the sound of Yates's voice greeting Mrs. Fletcher. "Miss Evans," he said as he entered the kitchen. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, rising from her chair. "Excellent. I thought we might start by introducing you to some of the townspeople and helping you learn the layout of Main Street." Grace nodded, reaching for her shawl which Mrs. Fletcher pressed into her hands. Outside, the morning air was crisp with early autumn. Grace took Yates's offered arm, feeling the solid strength of him beside her as they walked. "Main Street runs straight for about a quarter mile," he explained. "We're starting at the south end near Mrs. Fletcher's. First building on our right is the general store, run by the Coopers." Throughout the morning, Yates guided Grace along both sides of Main Street, introducing her to shopkeepers and townspeople. He described each building in detail: its size, color, the number of steps to the door, any distinctive features that might help her identify it. Grace concentrated on memorizing these details, building a mental map of her new surroundings. Most people they met were kind, though Grace could sense their curiosity. A few were openly pitying, which made her spine stiffen, but Yates never treated her as helpless. Instead, he described things matter-of-factly, letting her set the pace, asking occasionally if she wanted more detail about something. By midday, they had covered most of the town center. Grace's head was swimming with new information, but she felt a growing confidence in her ability to navigate at least parts of Chico independently. "You're doing remarkably well," Yates told her as they sat on a bench outside the small cafe where they'd stopped for lunch. "Most folks take days to learn even half of what you've absorbed this morning." Grace smiled, pleased by his praise. "I have an excellent guide." "I was thinking," Yates said after a moment, "Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you're a skilled cook." "I manage," Grace replied modestly. "The cafe here is looking for help in the kitchen," he continued. "Mrs. Larson, the owner, is getting on in years and finds the long days difficult. Would you be interested in speaking with her?" Grace turned toward him, surprised. "You think she would hire me, despite my limitation?" "I think she'd be a fool not to," Yates said firmly, "but you won't know unless you ask." After lunch, Yates introduced Grace to Mrs. Larson, a brisk, no-nonsense woman who asked Grace a series of questions about her cooking experience. "Can you make pies?" she demanded. "Yes, madam." "Apple, cherry, peach, and a decent custard. Biscuits, light as clouds, my father used to say." Mrs. Larson snorted. "We'll see about that. Can you work from sunrise till mid-afternoon 6 days a week?" "I can," Grace answered firmly. "The kitchen's hot, the work's hard, and I won't tolerate excuses." "I don't make excuses, Mrs. Larson, I make food. There was a pause, and then the older woman laughed, a surprisingly hearty sound. "You'll do, Miss Evans, you'll do. Can you start tomorrow?" Grace beamed. "Yes, madam." As they left the cafe, Grace clutched Yates's arm in excitement. "I can't believe it. My own position on my very first day in Chico." "I'm not surprised at all," Yates said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "You're a remarkable woman, Grace Evans." The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her, but she didn't comment on it. Instead, she asked, "And what of your position? Did you meet with your prospective employer yesterday?" "I did," Yates confirmed. "The freight company is set to begin operations next week. I'll be driving supply wagons between here and the railroad depot at first, eventually expanding to the smaller settlements as business grows." "That sounds promising," Grace said, genuinely pleased for him. "It is," he agreed. "It means I'll be based here in Chico, with regular routes but a place to call home." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Grace gathered her courage to ask, "Will you still? That is, would you be willing to continue helping me learn my way around Chico when you're not on the road?" "I'd like nothing better," Yates replied, his voice warm. "In fact, I was hoping you might join me for supper on Sunday. There's a spot by the river I'd like to show you. The view is, well, I'd like to describe it to you." Grace felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I'd like that very much." The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Grace rose early each morning to help Mrs. Fletcher with breakfast before walking the now familiar route to the cafe, where she spent her days in the busy kitchen. Her pies quickly became local favorites, and Mrs. Larson grudgingly admitted that Grace's biscuits were indeed light as clouds. Yates visited regularly, sometimes escorting her home after work, other times appearing at Mrs. Fletcher's in the evening to sit on the porch and talk. He began his new position with the freight company, making 2-day runs to the railroad depot and back. On Sundays, their day became a tradition: a walk by the river, a picnic lunch when weather permitted, and long conversations about everything and nothing. Yates described the changing seasons, the people they encountered, the buildings going up as Chico grew. Grace shared stories of her childhood, her dreams for the future, her daily triumphs in navigating her new world. As autumn deepened toward winter, Grace found herself increasingly drawn to Yates Sullivan. It wasn't just his kindness or the way he had become her guide in this new life. It was his thoughtfulness, his quiet strength, the respect with which he treated her, never defining her by her blindness but always acknowledging her whole self. One crisp November evening, as they sat on Mrs. Fletcher's porch despite the chill, Yates fell uncharacteristically silent. "Is something troubling you?" Grace asked, turning toward him. "No," he said quickly, then sighed. "Yes, perhaps. I've been offered a longer route, Grace. A good opportunity, more pay, but it would mean being gone for 2 weeks at a time." "I see," Grace said carefully, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. "That does sound like an excellent opportunity." "I'm not sure I want to take it," Yates admitted. "Why ever not?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because it would mean seeing less of you." Grace's heart quickened. "Oh, I've grown very fond of our time together," Yates continued, his voice low. "More than fond, if I'm being honest." Grace reached out carefully, finding his hand resting on the bench between them. She covered it with her own. "As have I." She felt him turn his hand palm up, his fingers curling around hers. "Grace, I don't want to presume. You're not presuming," she assured him, her voice barely above a whisper. Yates shifted closer, and she could feel the warmth of him beside her. "May I kiss you, Grace Evans?" In answer, she tilted her face up toward his. His lips, when they met hers, were gentle but certain. Grace felt a warmth spread through her unlike anything she had experienced before. When they parted, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the day we met," he confessed. Grace smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "And I with you, Yates Sullivan." The following Sunday, rather than their usual walk by the river, Yates took Grace to the small church on the edge of town. The building was new to her, and she held tightly to his arm as they climbed the steps. "The church is white clapboard," Yates described, "with a small steeple. Inside, there are 12 rows of pews and clear glass windows that let in the morning light." The service was lovely, the congregation welcoming. Afterward, as people gathered outside to socialize, Yates introduced Grace to more townspeople, including the minister and his wife. "Miss Evans has become quite the local celebrity," Reverend Cooper remarked. "My wife won't stop talking about your apple pies," Grace laughed, pleased. "Mrs. Larson deserves the credit for giving me the opportunity." "Nonsense," Mrs. Cooper insisted. "Talent speaks for itself." As they walked back toward Mrs. Fletcher's for Sunday dinner, Yates was unusually quiet again. "Another troubling opportunity," Grace teased gently. "What?" "Oh no," Yates chuckled, sounding distracted. "Actually, I've decided to decline the longer route. I prefer being here in Chico." "I'm selfishly glad," Grace admitted. They walked a few more steps before Yates stopped suddenly. "Grace, there's something I'd like to show you. It's a short detour from our usual route." Curious, Grace allowed him to guide her down what felt like a side street. They walked for perhaps 5 minutes before Yates stopped again. "We're on Pine Street," he explained. "It's a newer part of town with houses being built for growing families. There's one here I'd like to describe to you." "All right," Grace agreed, puzzled by his tone. "It's a modest house, white with green trim," Yates began. "2 stories with a covered porch across the front. There's space for a garden and a small stable at the back for a horse and perhaps a cow. Inside, there's a parlor, dining room, and kitchen downstairs, with 3 bedrooms upstairs." "It sounds lovely," Grace commented. "The kitchen has a large window that gets the morning sun," he continued, his voice warming to the subject. "Perfect for someone who enjoys baking. And the yard is level, with no unexpected steps or obstacles." A suspicion began to form in Grace's mind. "Yates, why are you telling me about this particular house?" She heard him take a deep breath. "Because I've purchased it. Or rather, I've put a down payment on it, with the condition that the final decision belongs to my future wife." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Your future wife." She heard movement, and then Yates's voice came from lower down. He had knelt before her. "Grace Evans, you've become the light in my darkness, the heart I didn't know I was missing. These past months have shown me what a remarkable, strong, beautiful woman you are. I can't imagine my life without you in it." His voice trembled slightly. "Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Grace's eyes as she reached out, finding his face with her hands, tracing the beloved features she had come to know through touch. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Yates Sullivan, I will marry you." He stood, gathering her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally parted, Grace asked, "When did you buy the house?" "Last week," he admitted. "I've been planning this proposal for a month, waiting for the right moment." "And all that about the longer route," Yates laughed. "A test, I'm afraid. I wanted to see if you'd encourage me to go." Grace swatted his arm lightly. "Devious man, forgive me," he asked, still chuckling. "Perhaps," she pretended to consider, "though it may take years." "I have years to offer you," he said softly. "A lifetime if you'll have them." The wedding took place on Christmas Eve, a small ceremony in the church with Mrs. Fletcher, Mrs. Larson, and the friends they had made in Chico in attendance. Grace wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her choose, with a sprig of holly in her hair. "You look beautiful," Yates whispered as he took her arm to lead her down the aisle. "Describe it to me," Grace requested. "The church, the decorations. Pine garlands hang along the pews with red ribbons," he began, his voice low and intimate. "Candles are lit in every window, casting a golden glow over everything. There's a light snow falling outside, but in here it's warm and smells of pine and beeswax." Grace smiled, picturing it all. When they reached the altar, Reverend Cooper asked who gave this woman to be married. "She gives herself," Mrs. Fletcher announced proudly, "but with the blessing of her friends." The service was simple and moving. When it came time for the rings, Grace felt the cool band slide onto her finger, then carefully placed its mate on Yates's hand. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Cooper declared. "You may kiss your bride." Yates's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise sealed before God and their community. When they turned to face the congregation, a spontaneous cheer went up that made Grace laugh with joy. Their new home welcomed them that night, filled with gifts from townspeople: quilts, dishes, pantry staples, and practical items for starting a household. Yates carried Grace over the threshold, describing each room again as they moved through the house. "And this," he said as he opened a door on the first floor, "is a surprise." He guided her inside, placing her hands on what felt like a desk. "I've set up a small office for you here," he explained. "Mrs. Larson mentioned you've been keeping the cafe's accounts as well as cooking. I thought you might want to expand that work." Grace explored the room, finding a chair, bookshelves, and most surprisingly, a typewriter. "How did you know I could type?" "Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you learned at school before your illness," Yates explained. "I thought perhaps you might offer bookkeeping services to local businesses. The raised markings on the keys should make it possible for you to use the typewriter." Grace was overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "You've thought of everything." "I want you to have independence," Yates said seriously. "Your own work, your own income if you wish it." Grace turned to embrace him. "Thank you for understanding that." Later that night, as they lay together in their marriage bed, Grace whispered, "You've given me so much, Yates. A home, a future, a place in this community." "You've given me far more," he replied, stroking her hair. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, never belonging anywhere. You've given me purpose, Grace, a reason to build something lasting." "We'll build it together," she promised. Spring came to Chico with renewed vigor. The garden Yates and Grace had planned during the winter months began to take shape, with raised beds that Grace could tend easily, each plant in a specific location she could remember. Yates had driven stakes into the ground with string lines between them to guide her paths through the garden. Grace's bookkeeping business grew steadily, with 3 local merchants now employing her services. She continued working part-time at the cafe, but increasingly focused on building her accounting practice, which she could manage from home. Yates's position with the freight company had proven successful, and he had been promoted to route manager, overseeing the expanding network of deliveries while still making regular runs himself. He was rarely gone more than 3 days at a time, and always returned with stories of his journeys and small gifts for Grace from neighboring towns. One warm evening in late May, as they sat on their front porch after supper, Grace took Yates's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I have news," she said softly. Yates went very still beside her. "Grace, are you saying?" "Yes," she confirmed, her face breaking into a radiant smile. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby sometime around Christmas." Yates let out a whoop of joy that surely could be heard across town, then gathered Grace into his arms, raining kisses on her face. "A baby, our baby. You're pleased then?" Grace teased, knowing full well the answer. "Pleased? I'm ecstatic." He placed a gentle hand back on her stomach. A little one here in our home. Grace, you've made me the happiest man alive." As her pregnancy progressed, Grace found herself surrounded by support. Mrs. Fletcher visited often, bringing advice and hand-sewn baby clothes. Mrs. Larson insisted on sending food whenever Yates was away on longer runs. Even the women of Chico, who had initially regarded Grace with pity, now sought her company, impressed by her independence and the successful life she had built. Yates was attentive and protective, sometimes excessively so, which occasionally led to good-natured arguments. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Grace would remind him when he tried to prevent her from doing her usual tasks. "Humor me," he would reply, stealing a kiss. "It's my first time being a father." As her due date approached, Yates arranged for a young woman from town, Emily Parker, to stay with Grace whenever he had to be away on runs. Though Grace protested that she was perfectly capable of managing alone, she secretly appreciated his concern. "You're not just caring for yourself now," Yates reminded her, his hand resting on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. "This little one needs you to accept help when it's offered." December brought heavy snows to Chico and the surrounding territory. Yates had arranged to make no runs during the month, staying close to home as they awaited their child's arrival. They spent the evenings by the fire, Yates reading aloud while Grace knitted tiny garments. On the morning of December 18th, Grace woke to the first pains of labor. She lay quietly for a moment, counting the minutes between contractions before waking Yates. "It's time," she said simply, squeezing his hand. The next hours passed in a blur of increasing pain and focused determination. Mrs. Fletcher arrived to help, along with the midwife, Mrs. Benson. Yates refused to leave Grace's side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement. As the winter afternoon darkened into evening, Grace's labor intensified. "I can't," she gasped after a particularly brutal contraction. "You can," Yates insisted, his voice firm but loving. "You're the strongest person I know, Yates Sullivan." His use of her married name centered her somehow, reminded her of all they had built together, all that waited on the other side of this pain. With a final, tremendous effort, Grace brought their child into the world. The lusty cry that filled the room was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "A boy," Mrs. Benson announced. "A fine, healthy boy." The midwife cleaned the baby quickly before placing him in Grace's eager arms. Grace's fingers gently explored her son's face, counting 10 tiny fingers and 10 perfect toes. "He's beautiful," Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, he's absolutely beautiful." "Describe him to me," Grace requested, tears of joy streaming down her face. "He has a tuft of dark hair," Yates began, his finger gently tracing their son's features. "Your delicate nose and chin, but I think he'll have my eyes there already, a clear blue. His ears are perfect little shells, and his mouth. He's yawning now, like he's already tired of all this commotion." Grace laughed through her tears. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Yates said, "What about Thomas? After your father?" Grace's heart swelled with love for this man who remembered even such small details of her past. "Thomas Sullivan. It's perfect." In the days that followed, they settled into life with their newborn. Yates proved to be a natural father, changing and bathing Thomas with ease, walking the floor with him when he was fussy so Grace could rest. "You're remarkable with him," Grace observed one evening as she listened to Yates singing softly to their son. "He makes it easy," Yates replied. "I just look at him and know exactly what he needs." As Thomas grew from newborn to infant to toddler, their family life blossomed. Grace's bookkeeping business continued to thrive, and she developed a system of raised markings that allowed her to read her ledgers by touch. Yates's freight company expanded, eventually allowing him to take on a partner so he could spend more time at home. When Thomas was 2, Grace gave birth to their daughter, Sarah, named for Yates's mother. Their home, once so new and empty, filled with the sounds of children's laughter, running feet, and family meals around the table Yates had crafted himself. Through it all, Yates remained Grace's eyes, describing the world in rich detail, their children's changing faces, the seasons as they passed, the growth of Chico around them. And Grace became his heart, bringing warmth and meaning to a life that had once been solitary and rootless. One summer evening, as they sat on their porch while the children played in the yard, Yates took Grace's hand in his. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming to Chico with me that day?" Grace turned toward him, her face serene in the fading light. "Not for a single moment," she answered truthfully. "You gave me a chance when most would have seen only my limitations. You became my eyes when I needed them most." "And you became my heart," Yates replied, echoing the words he had spoken at their wedding. "Teaching me what it means to truly love, to build a life worth living." Grace leaned against his shoulder, listening to the sounds of their children playing, the distant murmur of the town, and the steady beat of Yates's heart beneath her ear. "We built this together," she said softly. "This life, this family, this love. And we'll keep building it," Yates promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every day for all the days to come." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most, proving that the greatest journeys often begin with the simple act of one hand reaching out to another in kindness, and finding, miraculously, that the other hand was already reaching back.